important for long-term sustainable growth than investing in people. And this means nurturing children, improving nutrition, improving health conditions, improving and providing access to education for everybody, and very importantly, making sure that both men and women contribute to the economy. In Portugal now, the percentage of women and men in the labor market is the same. So the question then is, Pakistan. Where are we in Pakistan and what can we do? We tend to always look at the negative sides of the story because that sort of sparkles us. But I actually want to challenge you to think also on the positive sides, because there has been progress. True, I'm not going to argue with you that the progress is not what we wanted, but since 2010, we've definitely seen more children participating in school. And this is going from pre-primary all the way to secondary. We've also seen right now 9 in 10 persons having access to improved quality water. True, again, we're not yet there, but it's improving. And very importantly, and this is, as you can imagine, as a woman, very dear to my heart, we have more and more women delivering children under assisted deliveries and improved health conditions. The improvement here has been of 15 percentage points, which has resulted in a decrease in the number of women and children that die along with childbirth. Now, the question, and you're all saying, but you know, everybody says this is not rosy. Yes, there are big issues. And I could say that the big issue is that progress is uneven and it's slow. And the question I think for Pakistan to ask is, can the country afford this? Can the country afford not investing in its people for sustainable growth? Can actually the country afford to have almost half of its children at the age of 5 either severely stunted or moderately stunted? These are generations that are lost. Can the country actually afford to have only 9% of its youth engaged in some form of training, higher education, or post-basic education? And let me tell you that if people are from the poorest quintiles, this percentage goes down from 9 to 1%. And finally, can we have only 1 woman in 4 participating in the labor market? How many women could be contributing to the economy? So the question is, if human capital matters and investment in people matters, can the country afford this? Now, we can take either a very negative perspective, or we can, get our sleeves up and do something about it. So basically what I want to tell you is that the problems are solvable. So if Pakistan takes appropriate policies, and this is done quickly, then it can make its population not its biggest challenge, but its biggest asset. So the message is yet again investing in people. Okay, this is all very nice, but how can I, in such a short period of time, tell you what may be done, or how can we think about this? So bear with me, because I'm going to be very short and try to be clear. So how can we move the needle? Okay, expenditure has increased. That's true, both at the provincial level and at the federal level. But I'm sorry to tell you, money is never enough. So we need more money for social sectors. Further, we also need to know where to invest. And we need to invest efficiently and with quality. Otherwise, no matter how much money we have, it's going to be misused without results. Then, we cannot afford to have unskilled. We have to look at the poor, the unskilled, the vulnerable women. These are a large percentage of the population that we need to target. We cannot have a blind eye to this. Secondly, we also need to target investments, because at the end of the day, no matter how much money we have, when the challenges are big, we can't do it all. So the question is, which is the investment that is going to give me the highest return? And also, when we do investments and we focus on results, we tend to think, well, so what is it needed to be done? But we many times don't think about who is going to benefit from this. So let me give you a very concrete example. If my parents had not understood that education was important for me, it would have been pointless for the Portuguese government to open a new school in my small town. I would have not gone anyway. So we need to shift a little bit the way we think and focus more on what is it that the demand is and wants, what are the characteristics, and how do we adjust the supply. And finally, I don't think we have much time. So we need to act quickly. And acting quickly doesn't mean acting in a rush. It means being very strategic, focusing on results, putting the investments where they're most needed, focusing on the supply and demand, and having a concerted understanding of what the problem is and how we go about it. So in conclusion, I just want to remind you that human development, I would say, is not just a lifelong journey, is an individual and collective lifelong journey. And if Pakistan is indeed very serious about catching up with the other countries, it needs to invest in its people because human capital matters. Thank you.
You know, investing in human capital is really, really important, and we as a country need to recognize it because, like Christina said, we can't afford not to invest in it. I'd like to now invite Kulsum Lakhani. She's the CEO of Invest to Innovate, and she has a really exciting and fun presentation for us on startup ecosystem.
Hello, perfect. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. We've all been hearing already about growth entrepreneurship and actually its impact on job creation and economic growth. According to a study done by Ernst & Young that surveyed 12 major countries around the world, all of those entrepreneurs said that they plan to increase their workforce by 59% over the next year. That's an aggregate increase by 9.3%. So when I took that number and calculated it against the global labor force numbers, that actually equals 321 million jobs that just those 12 countries that were surveyed are creating every year. That's huge, right? What do startups mean in that narrative, though? When we talk about high-growth entrepreneurship, what are startups in this narrative? We've all heard about companies like Facebook and Google. Those are companies that are employing thousands of people around the world. Those are websites that we use on a regular basis. But once upon a time, those companies were just a few guys sitting in a small room with an idea. That's what a startup is. A startup is a company, a high-growth company in its most nascent stages. But in order to see those companies survive, there's a lot of different factors that come into play because startups can fail very easily. In order to see them survive, we need things like business support, policy environment, finance, and all of those things come together are actually called the startup ecosystem, which tends to be a really big buzzword that we use right now, so breaking it down for you. And in order to have a healthy startup ecosystem, all of those factors need to be in place. We need to have strong finance, we need to have a strong policy environment, we need to have culture, human capital, all of those things need to be moving forward for startups to survive. So let's go to a startup ecosystem that's actually considered very healthy and strong in the world. South Korea was actually ranked by Bloomberg's Innovation Index as the #1 most innovative country in the world for the last 3 years. South Korea is actually considered a healthy startup ecosystem and supportive of startups because of their patent activity is one of the highest in the world. They have very strong broadband activity, and they have a policy environment that's conducive to startups. Currently, the South Korean government is actually allocating 7% of their total government budget in order to support startups in South Korea, which actually will hopefully lead to creating 160,000 jobs over the next 5 years. And that's a conservative estimate. In Pakistan, where we need to create over 2 million jobs every year, particularly for our country's youth, the support of startups is actually a critical part of that, and actually improving our ecosystem is an even more critical part of how we support startups here in Pakistan. If we look at 5 years ago, there's actually been a significant amount of activity that has happened over the last 5 years. 5 years ago, there was just one incubator in Pakistan, one major incubator, and one major accelerator. No significant funding sources that were there, and actually just a handful of competitions and conferences that were happening. Just 5 years later, we have 12 incubators, active incubators that are happening, 5 acceleration programs, 9 active investor groups, and that number is growing. I actually was just at a conference where we saw even more investors that were there, and over 20 significant active conferences, and forums for entrepreneurs and for young entrepreneurs. And this is significant because Pakistan's startup ecosystem is actually driven by young people and young people who are technology enabled, some of whom I'm sure are in the room today. But what does that mean? It's great that we have all this support for entrepreneurs, but when we go back and look at the startup ecosystem, while we have a lot of support for entrepreneurs, where we are currently lacking is in the finance and policy side. So our major challenges really exist in improving those tenets of the startup ecosystem. So while we have a lot of startup programs in Pakistan that are graduating all these young entrepreneurs, we still lack early stage capital to see those entrepreneurs grow into high growing businesses and growth oriented businesses that can create the jobs that are necessary. And this is actually important because if startups don't get the capital that they are needed, they will not survive, they will likely die. Other issues that are related to startups, and are particularly in this environment here, are payments. So the fact that we don't have platforms that operate here like PayPal or other platforms. And the flow of money is really important, and how we actually improve that, especially as we think about how investors come in, how money flows in and out of Pakistan. Currently, our policy environment needs to drastically be improved. In the last panel, they were talking about taxation, and that actually includes startups, right? How can we actually improve the taxation policies to allow young businesses to actually survive, to register their businesses so that they're not in the informal economy, but in the formal part of the marketplace? I believe that Pakistan has the most innovation potential in the world. But unless we address these structural, broader challenges related to finance, related to policy, unless we mitigate risk that allows more investors to enter the market, we will not be able to address these broader challenges that will allow startups to turn into high-growth businesses, which is a missed opportunity for the job creation that's needed for Pakistan's future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kulsoom. And imagine the potential of investing in a startup ecosystem in Pakistan and where we could be, say, 5 or 10 years from now. So now we'd like to proceed to the panel discussion. So I'd like to invite the panelists up stage. So Kulsoom, you've got to come back. Christina, we could have you. We have Junaid Iqbal here, who's the managing director of Kareem. And we have Fasi Zaka, who's a public policy and communications expert. So if you could please take your seats. Okay, so Christina, you spoke about the importance of investing in human capital, and you know how it is really critical to sustain Pakistan's growth. Could you tell us a little bit about how we can accelerate the pace of these human development indicators?
Thank you very much. So I think I tried to give a bit of a framework, even if a rough one, during the talk. Considering that we need to look at finance, we need to look at targeting interventions, we need to look at supply and demand issues, and we also need to look at some specific groups and have a sense of results and movement. I guess perhaps the best way to respond to your question is to give a concrete example. You probably heard that we spoke here about stunting, which is a huge issue in all countries because it implies having a workforce that will not be as productive as it should and will not live its full life as it should. Now, stunting, unfortunately, is not just a characteristic of Pakistan. There are plenty of other countries in the world where stunting is high. But some of these countries have actually managed to very quickly reduce their stunting rates. And the case of Peru has been very well documented, and I'm going to give you a bit of an idea of how it happened, because not only Peru managed in less than 10 years to reduce in half its stunting rate, it to some extent used a framework similar to what I've tried to describe in the presentation. So in Peru, the issue is not so much the lack of money or even the lack of programs. It was the lack of coordination, the lack of concerted efforts, and the lack of leadership. And so the government of Peru basically decided to put the house in order and quite strongly take a decision on we need to get results and we need to fix the problem. So that was actually the first main point. We acknowledge a problem, we don't spend too much time discussing that this is a problem, we move forward to find a solution. Then they decided to put a strong emphasis on results. Where do we want to be in 10 years' time? What is the target we want to reach? Then the other part was, what is it that it's out there? And how is this linking the supply and the demand? For example, in some regions, there were communities that thought that being short was a genetic condition. And indeed, genetics defines the height, but there's a difference between genetics and being short because you're undernourished. And so there was a lot of understanding that was needed to take place in what were the specific characteristics of the community. Then there was a very strong effort of coordination of all actors. Everybody comes together under the same voice. We all have the same message. And then, very importantly, was the issue of choices. We cannot target everybody, so what are we going to do? So research tells us that the first 1,000 days in a child's life, so from 0 to 3 years of age, are the most important ones for the future development of the individual. So that was the choice that the government of Peru did. We're going to focus on children from 0 to 3. And we're going to have all messages focusing on that, all interventions concerted towards that. And this implied bringing together even departments that previously were doing something but in a disparate manner. So social protection programs with cash transfers, because is this an issue of poverty? Do we need to improve the economic level of the families? So cash transfers are very important. But cash transfers associated with behavioral communication are even more important, because oftentimes we also don't know very well that if we provide rice every day to our child is not hungry, but it's nonetheless not getting the sufficient nutrients. So we also need to know that bringing dal and rice is a much better option than just having a big dish of rice. Then education also played an essential role through young women, and also making sure that early childhood development is promoted in many centers. So at the end of the day, there was a very strong effort that implied, of course, increased financing, but also better use of the existing financing, concerted effort under a strong leadership from the government with the whole community supporting it, and a whole set of interventions very well targeted and focusing on results. And on the last point of results, this is a country that did not even use something that the bank likes very much, which is impact evaluations. Because basically what they did was to make sure that results were measured all the way. And so by just making sure that every time a child was going to a health center or a nutrition center, it would be measured, it would be weighted, there was a lot of feedback information that systematically allowed for correction of the programs. And so this is an example on how the use of this feedback of information and measurements actually made the program to act in a quick manner.
Okay, thanks, Christina. I mean, just to emphasize, 44% children in Pakistan today are stunted, so that's every second child almost. And thank you for also emphasizing that in order to approach stunting like Peru did, we need to adopt a multi-sectoral approach, and education is really sort of important. So Fasi, coming to you, what in the recent years have been the major education reforms in the country, and which of them have received traction from the media?
So in Pakistan, most of the media that's been covered by education reforms that have been covered by the media are mainly around supply side issues. So it's discussion on budgets, it's discussion on what the provincial governments are doing, what kind of supplies they're bringing in, whether it's boundary walls or certain facilities. And to a degree, that's been fairly successful. The issue is that as we're moving further along the stage, is that the success that we've seen in the media covering education is in a relatively uncontentious space, right? The idea to allocate more money to education is not as problematic a one as, say, firing teachers, changing the education system, revising the curriculum, or raising standards. And that's the next phase that we have to get into. So in terms of how, say, the media would actually be useful at this stage, in that particular part, there's going to be a lot more consensus building that will be required. Another area that we've also seen is that we've done some surveys in Lahore, and when you look at the aim of education reform is that it needs to be endorsed and accepted. So if the transmission vehicle is the media, what we've seen with education departments or reporters is that out of, let's say, in 30 different print and electronic media we saw in the Punjab, out of them, 29 were multi-beat journalists. So they were covering crime, they were covering education, they were covering events. And if you're going to then expect a journalist who is as pressurized as that to have a macro bird's eye view of the education sector, there was only one who was solely dedicated to it. So we discovered that, if you wanted a discussion around, let's say, what do these participation rates mean? Are they different? Should we be looking at another measure? We discovered that the Punjab government has actually made all its data open through the PMIU. And the number of pieces that the press has actually carried is incredibly small because the kind of data journalism required for this hasn't happened. So what we've actually seen is that we have seen the quantum of coverage for education and reform, but a lot of it is reproduction of what is put out by the donor community, whereas the aim would be is that the educational thought leadership should be coming from the press itself. And that right now I think is still quite nascent. It is because of the pressures of how the beats have been allocated, but also I think it's going to be incredibly important in the coming years because while we talk about investments to education, we do know if tomorrow we quadrupled the budget, the government wouldn't be able to expand the system as quickly. But the other thing would also be is that we have kids in grade 5 who have learning attainment levels that are actually half of what they should be at grade 3. So the idea is that if you're going to keep kids longer in school, they better be learning more. And that's the critical part. I think that's an area where revisions and as reform gathers pace, we're going to find that it's going to be a bit more contentious than we've seen so far.
Right. And, it's sort of really, really important. I mean, you've spoken about the issues of capacity within the media, but you've sort of also highlighted a really important point in education because a recent World Development Report also talks about the quality of learning and, to focus on the softer side of education rather than the hardware only. Just sort of elaborating on what you just said, if you could sort of talk a little bit more about how do you envision the role of media in supporting politically difficult reforms? Because, we think about capacity, we think about ratings, and human development, like Christina said, is just really, really critical for growth. And as you rightly said, the media can play a really substantive role, but how can this happen?
So I think that's really interesting actually, because sometimes the question is, what can the media do? And sometimes it predicates it on having good intentions on the part of the media, which by and large they do, but we need to approach these things not with how we think the media should be, but actually how it is. So in Pakistan, for example, on these contentious issues, we do know our media is more populist than sitting governments or even opposition parties sometimes. And when you're talking about difficult policy choices, what you're really talking about is nuance, which we sometimes don't have. I'll just segue into an example. We've had, in the past 10 years, 2 airline crashes around in Islamabad. And on the night of those particular crashes, we had, people on TV asking if they knew it was going to crash, if they had just flown it a foot above the ground, everyone could have jumped off, individually. and then people wondering if they can find the black box because it's black and it's night, whereas it's orange. But the interesting thing to that is that within the vicinity of Islamabad, there are two universities. There's an air university, there's an aeronautical engineering, so the expertise is there. The reason that we sometimes find that there is this lack, because there's actually a very low investment in the media itself. If you look at the predominance of programming in Pakistan, it's one anchor, 4 people, you encourage them to argue because that is the cheapest form of programming you can get. You don't need research, you don't need producers, and it's something that's reproduced across the spectrum with some notable exceptions. So now, the duty then becomes is that for these nuanced things, even if we look at issues like water, we know that water is a problem in Pakistan, and one of the big solutions is probably going to be the least palatable, which is water pricing, and making sure that it's done correctly. And for that, about 10 years ago in 2010, we have discovered is that if you change your approach to the media, recognize that they have capacity constraints, recognize that there's also a viewership constraint. If you do a program on social issues on Balochistan, the viewer will punish you. You get a 0 rating the next day because our media is also very metropolitan focused. So issues like education, health, they tend to be ignored because the media is also composed of people who are also buying out of the system through, private options. The way to do it would be, as opposed to just giving press releases, which is the norm, as opposed to just giving a report, is actually engaging with the media, assessing what they believe. 10 years ago, we did a program for DFID, and the challenge was that in 1 month's time, we get more attention to education than had been given in the past 3 years. And the way that we actually achieved it is we wondered why the media wasn't paying attention to education. And we discovered fundamentally 3 things. We're a poor country. We've missed the boat. If we didn't do it in 70 years, it's pointless to do it now. And that we've got new problems and we can't afford to solve those problems. And the way we framed it eventually got everybody's attention. We got 60 hours of primetime TV for free, 2 weeks of radio telethons. We got about 12 international articles, about 60 individual articles in Pakistan. All we had to say was show them 12 countries poorer than Pakistan that had better attainment. So that proved that there was also an efficiency component to this. That the amount of money that it would take, in those days, terrorism was a big issue, but the floods were also new, and they had really shocked Pakistan. So then the indirect costs of showing that actually not educating this total out-of-school population is the equivalent of 1 flood every year. And a third one was, again, just pointing out a number of facets. So what they did was that the turning point for them came is that it's a solvable problem. That Pakistan is not a very uniquely placed country, that we can afford to let go of this responsibility in the social contract to the citizens. So the point I'm making is for these particularly difficult issues, whether it's water pricing, whether it's issues of stunting, whether it's health reform, there's a lot in education reform that is very dicey and difficult that even donors don't want to get into because the backlash is immediate and it's very harsh, especially when it comes to curriculum design. But for that, it's understanding what the media believes, and rather than just creating a product which states your policy position,
Right.
but it needs to be tailored, because that's the only way it'll get traction.
Okay. Yes, very important, Fasi. We need to frame the issue and sort of bring in best global practices from across the world, and think the World Bank is very well positioned to do that. But I do get your point to that we have to resonate with audiences and sort of link it up and frame it in a way that becomes really human and becomes about it. It is about each and every one of us and something that impacts all our lives. And now the other thing that's impacting our lives is the great mushrooming of startup across the country. And I'm happy to have Junaid here. Junaid, Kulsum, do you have a mic?
Now I do.
Okay, great. So Kulsum just spoke about technology and connectivity and how that's all important. And do you think that technology is a game changer for a country like Pakistan in terms of how it can propel growth forward?
Absolutely. If you look at job creation, there are various statistics out there. Let's say people say about 20 million people are out of jobs. Now, if you look at Careem as a platform, as a starter, it has started connecting right providers with right seekers. This is going to go into the medical profession where you'll be able to connect with doctors. Now, I see all the time young doctors in Punjab protesting on Mall Road every couple of weeks, choking the entire traffic, not being paid enough. They're talking about their base salary. I mean, they should not be worrying about their base salary. They can be connected directly to people who need healthcare eventually through some platform. Let me give you an example. 2 weeks ago, the Careem Karachi team organized Super Saturday. They called it Gulabi Saturday. In one day, they went all over the city recruiting people who would drive cars, rickshaws, or bikes. In one day, 1,700 jobs were created. One day. So our mission is that by 31st December 2020, we would have created 1 million jobs on just this one platform. So if you look at Careem, if you look at similar applications for doctors on demand or for blue-collar labor on demand, that is a plumber on demand, electrician on demand, the number of jobs you can create and the contribution to GDP can be significant. I feel that the online marketplace itself, by 2020, will contribute more than 1% of the GDP. And I'm not at liberty to share numbers, but that's the trajectory we're working on. Now let's look at women in the workplace. Now we've tried to be bold. We've tried getting women to be Careem captains. There are more than 100 of them now. But that won't change immediately. It will take time for societal change. But what about food? Now food delivery is exploding. People are ordering food from Pizza Hut and whatnot online through apps. It is only a matter of time. It's only a matter of months. There are multiple startups who are working on delivery of home-cooked food. Now imagine the number of people, millions of people sitting in their homes selling home-cooked food through applications. I mean, let's say it's called Ghar Ka Khana app, and you see a biryani that I have made, which Kulsum has previously rated 4.8, and someone looks at it and swipes right, and the closest Careem bike rider picks up that biryani, brings it to Fasi's dinner table in less than 10 minutes while it's still piping hot. In the background, an Easy Paisa account has been mobilized on both ends. The rider has been paid. I've been paid for my hard work and my biryani. And let's imagine there is another app called Sabzi Gosht PK, which has an API integration with this Ghar Ka Khana app, which automatically pings me saying that you've delivered 20 biryani orders this week. You're running out of rice and piyaz and this and that. Would you like to place this bucketed order? And I press yes. And similarly, someone is going and picking up, another Careem rider is picking up my grocery order from somewhere close and dropping it to my doorstep while I'm at work. All of these 30 different transactions have happened. They've happened in a cashless way. They're all documented for the economy to be taxed in the future. And this has all happened without a conversation. This has all happened without inefficiencies. This is not the future. This is not Star Trek 2030 that will happen. This is not teleportation. It is already here. It has started. All of these components are already here. And as I said, just the online marketplace will be 1% of GDP. So let's assume GDP grows at 6-7% every year. By 2030, let's say we're at about $320 billion of GDP. Easily $3.2 billion can be contributed only by the online marketplace.
That's really huge. And
As long as you don't cook the biryani. As long as you don't cook
Okay,
the
so
biryani.
before we order our online biryani, I think it's really
By the
sort
way,
of...
I don't know how to make biryani. I want to clarify that.
That's what
But
I
neither
was
do
saying.
I.
As long as the biryani is not cooked by him, this is going to be fine.
Okay, who likes biryani? Hands up. So there's a market for online biryani right
I'm going to
here.
go home and learn biryani today. Shan Masala Zindabad.
Shan. Okay. No sales pitch, Sunil. Okay, so moving on, and just imagine, Junaid, that you have a genie in a bottle, and given your experience of successful startup, if you were to have 2 or 3 concrete policy asks, I mean, what would they be?
So where we stand right now, every province operates differently. So right now, it's a challenge to explain to every province first to the transport department that Kareem is not a transport company. Kareem or Sukoon.pk or Travely, which is not there anymore, we are not transport companies. We are tech platforms. And currently, the underlying service providers who use our platform to meet customers are transport providers. Just the way if tomorrow we open Doctors on Demand, we will not become a hospital, right? So to explain that distinction, that what is a technology platform and what is an underlying service provider. So technology platform must be recognized as a company type in company law, because that then has implications on tax laws. Secondly, you come to taxation. So if they do agree that fine, you are the tech company and the underlying service provider is the transport service provider, who's the individual who's driving a private car. Then there are issues of whether the car can be kept private or it has to be converted to public. Sindh has agreed that the car can remain private. They just have to pay the excise duty and also get the fitness certificate and get the route permits. And then the day you don't want to drive it as a public vehicle, you tear up that page and you're set. So others might replicate this. Now the issue here is, Marine, that you've got 4 provinces and you have Islamabad operating like a province. Each of them have a separate tax unit, have a separate transport unit, have a separate labor unit. So in essence, you're having the same conversation with 15 different jurisdictions with an average turnover of the secretary every 3 months. So imagine the number of people who we've had to educate on the same matter. A simple policy asks, number 1, recognize technology platforms as separate online marketplaces. That's Daraz, that is us, that's TCS Evo. Understand that we're not the service provider or the manufacturer, we're a connector, number 1. Number 2, come up with a zero-rated regime right now on sales tax for the various service providers, whether they are drivers or captains, whether they are doctors. Get the documentation in place, encourage them to come on our platform and say that for the first 5 years it's zero rated, then it goes to X, Y, Z and slowly raise it up. Because if you start taxing the person the captain who's driving the car, then you're putting him at a disadvantage, because theoretically the bus is also supposed to pay sales tax and the rickshaw is also supposed to pay sales tax, but they don't. Let us bring the rickshaw, the bus, the bike, the car in the tax net, make it zero rated, make it that for 5 years and let it grow. And the third is online marketplaces. We need a lot of technology companies. All of them should be given some kind of a tax incentive. And the investors have to be given some kind of a tax break on their equity investment. In Pakistan, the traditional people who are owners of capital became rich during commodity booms. So cotton went up, someone became rich. Textiles, cement went up, someone became rich. All of them have the same background. 3 big commodities, and then so you started as a trader, became rich, then you opened a factory, and then further from there you became rich based on SROs or rebates, right? There was no thinking. So it is non-palatable for the traditional Pakistani business house to invest in a business which makes a loss. It's beyond their understanding that, oh my God, you're giving a ride from the airport for 450 rupees with a loss that is this much. How will you make money? Well, you'll make money eventually. Your burn will reduce over a period of time. So the government needs to understand that capitalists in Pakistan usually require a 3-year payback. They are rent seekers. That's why everyone only wants to invest in power. And so to encourage them to invest in startups, a point that Kulsoom raised, it's a key piece of the puzzle. You will have to come up with a policy. So 4 things: recognize tech platforms as separate entities, have a zero-rated sales tax regime for underlying service providers who serve various types of services on these platforms, have an incentive for the tech platforms on taxation, and have an incentive for investors to invest in tech companies.
Right. So I gave you 3. The genie gave you 3, but you asked for 4, and that's okay. We're feeling generous.
Bonus.
We're feeling generous. Okay, but that brings me to another really important conversation that has been happening, and Kulsum talked about it a little bit, on e-commerce. And the challenges around e-commerce. Kulsum talked about the payment issues, etc. So how do you think the public policy and the private sector space can sort of interface to address the gaps in this space?
So there are 3 critical components of e-commerce. You need the platform, which we already have. There are many. There is Kareem is an e-commerce platform, Daraz is, Yevo is, there are many. They're selling you something. The 2 other legs it need, it's a 3-leg system, is the last mile delivery. And people like ourselves have gotten into the bike business, so it's natural we will get into the delivery component of it. The third is payments. As soon as you solve for payments, delivery and the interface, e-commerce starts to work like a well-oiled machine. Now the issue with payments is all the technologies here. You've got several fintechs. You've got MobiCash, Telenor, EasyPesa. You've got Finja, who has SimSim. You have Kinu, and you have Innovate, who's got PhonePe. All of these have covered various aspects. Someone can enable you to take money directly from your bank account and using an e-MasterCard Pay and online platform. Someone enables you to top up a wallet from your bank account and pay someone through that wallet. None of these are seamless. All State Bank has to do is issue a 3-liner letter saying you can pull money from banks directly. That's it. Now the bankers are very interesting. Right? Banks in Pakistan do only 2 things. The admin guy is very important because he opens branches. You collect deposits. Every alternate Wednesday, there is a treasury bill auction. You take money from the public, you give it to the government, you lend it to the government at a spread of 5%. Everyone goes home happy. Habib Banks makes $300 million a year. UBL makes about $220 million a year. Even small banks make 8 billion rupees a year. Everyone goes happy. They are so afraid that if the pull function is enabled, all the money will go away. Where will it go? Like, I will not take all the money and move my money in my Kareem wallet, or take all my deposit lifetime savings from my Alfala account and deposit it in my Daraz wallet. No, it's not going to happen. The money will still remain in the system. Right. It's just that the push and pull becomes easy. State Bank literally has to give a 1-liner saying that you're allowed to pull. So these fintechs can pull directly from the bank account and pay the vendor. And secondly, the limit on the amount of transfer. So there are such strange limits, 5,000 in a day, no more than 200,000 in a month, this and that. How can business prosper like that? So if State Bank allows that, e-commerce will explode. You'll have people sitting in their homes, providing services, getting paid. Now, my warning to banks is that if they don't wake up and they don't get out of this fear that their deposit will go away, pure electronic banks, pure e-banks will take over, and that's when your deposit will truly run away from you. So to all the big 5, big 7 banks who make an average of $100 million a year of profits, bank presidents are paid anywhere from $600,000 to $2.5 million a year in salaries, have no idea about what is about to happen to them. What will happen to them is what happened to the taxi medallion owners in New York. Right. So I would love for them to wake up today and embrace and work with State Bank, get this 1-liner SRO out, and become a part of this ecosystem, or bye-bye.
Okay, so interesting thoughts and interesting ideas, and as we see the potential of the e-commerce exploding, and it brings me to a really, really important point again that Christina made on the female participation in the labor force. And Kulsum, you've worked for the past 6 years, is it? With a lot of women entrepreneurs. And how do you compare the challenges that the women entrepreneurs face compared to the men? And, you know, some ideas on how these challenges could be addressed?
Sure. So over the last 6 years, our program hasn't just worked with women-led companies. We've worked with both male-led and female-led companies. But what's been really interesting, because this is a global issue, it's not just a Pakistan issue of women's participation in the labor force, but specifically women in technology and women in entrepreneurship. But what we've seen with our numbers is that our companies have raised $3.7 million in funding, but 86% of that has been by our female-led companies. So for me, what that statistic shows is that when women are given the opportunity to do something, they tend to perform better. Revenue growth-wise... Thank you.
I notice only the women are clapping.
We should all be celebrating that. That's a really good statistic. But I think beyond that, right, when we kind of go back and ask ourselves, well, when they're given the opportunity, right? So why aren't they always given the opportunity? Why aren't they always showing up at the table? When you're at a conference, like I was just at a conference over the weekend, I was one of 7 men on my panel on investment, right? So that participation is important, but that comes down to a question of access. And I think this is why companies like Greem are really important. I know CNN just did a piece on you guys in terms of the mobility issue. And this is an issue of women in the labor force generally. How are we getting them access into being able to go into the office generally? How are they being able to access their customers? What are we doing to be able to find women that are creating really amazing businesses? We know there's a lot of homegrown businesses where people are leveraging Facebook right now in Pakistan. But a lot of times those are people that are part of the informal marketplace. They don't have formal businesses. So what are we doing to actually create entrance for that? Currently, our program is female-led companies, thanks to a partnership we're doing with Garandaz. And they're amazing, all of these companies. But what's interesting is some of the challenges that come up, and we're dealing with it as it comes, is, women are mothers, right? Of course. And they have to think about, if they're coming to our program on the weekend, what are we doing to create options for their kids to be able to be in activities in daycare? What are we doing to be more flexible with timings and things like that? And so I think being able to design from the perspective of what women need, because we know when they're given the opportunity, they're able to perform far beyond what our expectations are. So I think it's really an opportunity for all of that.
Yes, and the multiple roles that a woman plays is, a recognition of that is really, really important. And so with this important thought, we're going to open the floor for questions. Please identify yourselves and keep your questions as brief as possible, because lunch is waiting.
Do you want paper in case?
Okay. Ban, you want to go first?
Can you hear me? Yes? So I have a question for you, Junaid, in terms of the potential for technology to enable growth. In a country like Pakistan, where we have the Human Development Challenge, education quality is low, is there a risk of leaving people behind in this journey in growth which is driven by technology? And how do we make sure this is an inclusive process?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe we can take a couple of more questions. Lady at the back.
Hello. My name is Ariba Shah. I'm a lecturer of Mass Communication and Media Studies from Greenwich University. My question is for Mr. Zaka. And as you mentioned that the education sector is being ignored because of viewership and TRPs. But as you know, the TRPs and viewership is based on TRPs, and TRPs are not very transparent here in Pakistan. So eliminating that factor, what do you think else is hindering our news bulletins from including the news sector or the education news? Because we see very few bulletins which has news about education or schools running in the country. Thank you.
Okay, so we just take one more question and then revert back to the panelists.
Yes, my name is Hamas Deki, Country Director, Center for International Private Enterprise. Wonderful presentations. So I have a question kind of a thing, which I don't think it's a question. The issue is how do you save these young startups from being chopped away as soon as they start their businesses? You have to let them fail. A lot of startups, a lot of failures will only create the ecosystem, the momentum within the country. One of the things maybe to suggest is to start very early, perhaps teaching entrepreneurship at the level of university. Maybe, we are losing the opportunity. Why don't we start looking at introducing this fantastic subject of entrepreneurship at the school level? You actually, you set your direction pretty early in countries like Pakistan and India and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Bhutan. There is a peer pressure from parents, from others also. So for instance, what is the policy towards that? Saib worked in Afghanistan, brought in a curriculum which was taught in Eastern Europe. I got it translated in Urdu and localized. There is no taker in Pakistan at the moment. Is there anybody in this room who is interested in taking that curriculum and implement it? I'll be happy to share that curriculum with you. The second issue is that people like Junaid brings in such a wonderful idea to Pakistan, and then his whole system ceased for 2 days almost. And then he has to run around and talk to people who in power to explain them what is happening. So with the taxes, with non-availability of these enabling policies, you're actually chopping all these business straight away. Young people, and I would think only technology business can bring in the momentum in this country. So all of us sitting in this room, World Bank, donor agencies, firstly, you can play a big role in it. Bring these government people together and teach them, the way some people in our circle taught judges to understand what electronic crime thing is, still I don't know whether they understand or not. And then only the momentum will start in this country. Otherwise, we all will struggle. You will struggle, continue struggling. Banks will not agree to it because everybody is trying to protect themselves from this risk. How do you work in that environment?
Okay.
With the gender gap report, 143 paying out of 144 countries, we don't realize it. We don't even talk about it. People think, I was in Peshawar earlier this week, and people start thinking, is this a conspiracy against Pakistan? Is this so? There are 144 countries in this report. We are only above Yemen in this gender gap report. How do we bring in these young women coming out of university and provide them this biryani cooking opportunity, maybe using the application, and help them become entrepreneurs?
Right.
It's a big question. So
Okay.
I think I went a little longer because of the passion that I have for entrepreneurship, but these are some of the things which
Okay.
we need to be
So,
addressed.
so Junaid, if you could respond to Aban's question on human development, and then Fasi can talk about the media, and Kulsoom, perhaps you can talk about the startup.
So Aban, if you look at it, there's already 123 million smartphones in Pakistan. So the first myth people say when we talk about technology is like, oh, are there enough people who use, are there enough smartphones in Pakistan? So there's already 123 million smartphones. Q Mobile itself sells close to 500,000 smartphones a month. Secondly, there are already 40 million internet users in Pakistan, a lot of them on 3G. So the adoption is a lot faster than you would think. Now, the opportunity this is creating, yes, there is a bit of a threat. The opportunity this is creating is with each of these platforms, it's giving us a microphone. It's giving us direct access. So for example, we've started pushing educational content to our captains. Now, whether that might be training related to our service right now, but that's a first step. Constant pushes on harassment training, on awareness about customer service, about financial literacy. So these are creating platforms, and it's laying the pipe for that open communication. What we are starting to work on next is literacy on both ends. So we're starting to talk to various education systems and see how can we ensure that the children of all captains are educated. But secondly, and even more importantly, we've started talking to people to learn what are various adult literacy platforms we can use in a smart way to really raise the knowledge and education level of all the people who are coming in our networks, whether that could be financial literacy, that could be making them aware of what kind of education tools and environment do their children need to really unleash the potential of their families. Things as simple as working 12 hours a day. Like it's considered you go to a developed country, the roads are full at 6 a.m. And then the peak traffic in the night goes on till 9. People are working hard. Over here, if someone works 5 hours, they feel that they've worked really hard. This is basic education and messaging that has to get to everyone. The other messaging is, oh, I've done my MBA. You're talking about leaving people behind, right? The educated people are at the greatest risk. Oh, I've done my MBA. I'm not going to do anything till I get a job in Engro.
Right.
Get off your bum, like get going. You know, Elon Musk worked for McDonald's. Didn't mean that was his fate. You became a part of the economic process.
Right.
And I think that is what technology will enable people to do. So, and once you have a smartphone that you're using for ABC, it's a tool for all of us to start pushing better content. Now, let's look at the agriculture sector, for example. We have massive issues in milk wastage. We have massive issues in fruit and vegetable wastage. We have massive issues in delivery of urea and pesticides, the number of middlemen, the number of areas where margin gets eroded. It's a matter of time. Within the next 24 months, farmers will order urea directly on their phone, and farmers will sell their produce through their phone. And that is a tool. That is an audience. And the responsibility then lies with people like ourselves who are developing this ecosystem to use that pipe, to use that communication platform to deliver education, not just related to those business areas that they're involved in, but for the general upliftment of our community.
Okay, so Christina, I just want to quickly ask what your thoughts are about this interface of technology and human development. I think it's just a really, really important nexus to explore.
Well, clearly, if you have a human development basis that it's poor, you necessarily have challenges. But I think what we heard that it's very interesting, and I was even thinking of having a follow-up conversation with you, is on how we can use the platforms that exist to improve that baseline. Because there is what can be done through the education system, obviously, and that's a very strong focus. But as I think Fasi mentioned, the out-of-school population is huge in this country. And this population needs to be targeted in different ways.
Right.
And there are also issues around population. There are many open doors that can be used and where technology can be used. Will we leave behind some people? For sure, but the penetration is more and more. And we've seen even in places like Africa where mobile banking has been incredible and penetrating everywhere. So I think there is strong potential there.
Great. So moving on to Fasi and the question on media.
As far as I remember your question, the first is yes, the rating systems is problematic in Pakistan. The sampling isn't as large as it should be, and it's very focused on cities. The other problem is, as far as why doesn't education make the cut, for different reasons. One is that education would have probably been more important of an issue if the provision by the state was so bad that the other choice would be that they would remain undereducated. A lot of people have voted with their feet because there's been this massive explosion of low-cost private schools, which are moderately better. They're not as expensive. So in some ways, an imperfect solution is there. And that's one of the reasons why the articulation of the demand isn't as strong as we would see in cases where, like, an education system, which is an exclusive provider, and it suddenly takes a nosedive. You'd find that articulation, that political demand would be really strong. The presence of this whole low-cost private system is one of the reasons why we find, and that's why also the media doesn't really put it up. The other thing is that our media is also very nascent. In 2002, we had 2 channels. In 2005, we had 86, right? It was a massive explosion, and the education market could not provide enough trained market in a span of 3 years. The interesting thing is, like, most of our home connections are analog cable. You can only get 85 channels in them, but every year we're adding more and more channels.
Yeah.
and still the education market can't compete. So for people to actually, provide good commentary on the policy, or there is a constraint within the media itself. And lastly, it is also something to accept, and this is a sad fact, but even countries where you have a lot of advancements like the US, you have some really great media outlets. You've got NPR, but at the same time it's got a correspondingly, Fox is what people watch, and NPR is what a more minor fraction. So in some ways the ambition also is curtailed by just how people are. And lastly is education is one of those things where there's a long-term accrual of benefits in the primary years. There's more of a social accrual of benefits. The economic rates of return come when you're much older in secondary, higher secondary, and most of our kids don't make it that far. So all these things sort of contribute to that. Even when you do have a desire for the media to do the right thing, there is a natural limitation to this. So that's one of the issues. The one thing that can be done is we've seen like the healthcare system had a debate, a very small one for a very brief period this past year, especially in the Punjab, because one woman gave birth out in the street, another died in the waiting room. And then for people who do work in this area, this is the time actually, because on a normal news cycle, right, when Nawaz Sharif is fighting Imran Khan, nobody wants to talk about the healthcare system because that's exciting, whatever. But when these things, these unfortunate tragedies do happen, at least the communications arm of think tanks and all that, they need to be slightly opportunistic, because that's the one time they'll have a very receptive audience. So that's one workaround for this.
Okay, so just a note for our Facebook audiences. We are live on Facebook right now, and I hope everybody's using the hashtag PDU2017 and tweet away and post away, everyone, because these are really interesting points and a lot of food for thought for all of us. Kulsoom, coming to you with the startup question.
Yeah. First, I wanted to quickly address Aban's point as well, because Junaid brought up a really good point about smartphone penetration in Pakistan. So that's around 80% based on the numbers, right? But what's interesting is also the fact, I think one thing that's a responsibility on people working in the ecosystem and startups that are coming up is that just because you have a smartphone doesn't necessarily mean you know how to use it properly. Right. So things that we found that for people who are illiterate that have smartphones, they tend to download Facebook, they have someone actually put in their information for them, and they use it mostly for videos, right? So then thinking about from a startup perspective, how are you reaching customers like that are using smartphones, but they're using it in a different way? One of our companies, to give a shout out to one of our companies right now, is a job platform, like a job marketplace, but specifically for workers who are illiterate. Right. So the way that they've designed it is actually using icons instead of words and text, right? So I think it's also the responsibility for people that are coming up to be inclusive when they're designing for their customer base, and realizing that even though we have these great technology numbers, technology isn't always inclusive on its own. So for Hamad Sab, I actually echo your passion. I am as passionate as you are about this space. And I agree with you. I actually think we should let people fail. I think failure is a really good thing. And I think oftentimes here in Pakistan, we see it as an end. So people will go then say, okay, I failed. I'm going to go now work at Engro. Or I'm going to go work at a bank or something like that. Or your parents were like, you should have done that in the first place. But I think the interesting thing is we need to be viewing failure as a process, not as an end. But also, my point in my presentation wasn't that we shouldn't let startups fail, is that currently the environment that we have are letting the ones that could have succeeded still fall through the cracks, right? So, and going to your point about education, I think creating a culture of failure, creating a culture where kids can think critically doesn't even start in university. I think the Nest.io, which is an amazing incubator here in Karachi, does a really amazing boot camp for kids like here in Karachi that can actually go and attend it. And I think it's not just teaching entrepreneurship. The fundamental point of entrepreneurship is critical thinking, right? And currently our education system does not really value critical thinking in our schools. We don't teach people to think creatively and out of the box. We don't allow them to think bigger, right? So a lot of the startups that come to us, a lot of times aren't thinking big enough. And we have to get them to break out of the mold of how they're viewing things, how big they can be. And that's also, that's a function of the education system that we're all a part of. And so that goes back to beyond university, go back to elementary school, like kids in grade school here in Pakistan. These are things that you can teach from creativity, from getting kids to try things. Those are things that we can implement really early on, and it's not just an entrepreneurship class. So I completely agree with that, but I think that's something that we can implement earlier.
Right. And really important messages from Kulsum. Failure is good and think big. And, that process has to start really early on in life. Okay, so we have time for at least 2 questions, and that's about it. So the gentleman,
Hello.
I think this gentleman, please, he's been waiting for a while. No, please go ahead. Yeah.
Actually, I have an important question to Ms. Christina, and then one idea for Mr. Junaid Iqbal. Actually, Ms. Christina, you spoke about we need to invest in human capital, and it's important. I think no, it's very important to invest in human capital. But if we speak about in Pakistani perspective, we are giving education to peoples and increasing the education rate or enrollment of children are increasing in schools. But what if we only work on the education and we don't have capacity in industry to adjust those peoples, what they will feel, and how can we overcome to those people? Like if government is providing vocational trainings or other institutions are providing vocational trainings, and after completing the trainings, what women in villages, in small villages in Pakistan, they are, after completing the vocational trainings, they are selling their products on a very small rate as compared to those products are available in market in like Karachi or in other metropolitan cities in Pakistan. And idea for Mr. Junaid Iqbal, so why don't you create a channel for those small, medium enterprises, like in underprivileged areas, like वहाँ से जो products उनसे वो they can directly sell in the mega cities, and it will be helpful not only to improve the living standards of those people's women, those are living in the villages and working hard to make those products and receiving very low wages.
Okay. One last question, and then we'll revert to the panelists.
Hello.
Just one last question.
Okay,
That's all the time we have.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
My name is Salman, and my question to Mr. Junaid. So you talk about that e-commerce, regarding e-commerce. I'm going to ask you that how are you going to secure, the first point is money, and the second point is customer satisfaction. In terms of, let's suppose when we talk about the e-commerce, my friends in the university, they talk about that if we going to order any product online, so they have really, they have concerns about the quality of the product. That let's suppose once I order something and I'm getting the something else, which I saw on the online, on the web page. So how are you going to secure the customer satisfaction in terms of quality? And the second is that how are you going to secure the money points? Like you talk about 2 or 3 firms, those who are giving, the financial benefit to customers, but what are as?
Okay, so Christina, would you like to go first?
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your question.
Ma'am,
I
this
think
last question.
the first point.
If may I have 2 minutes?
Sorry?
I have
Sorry?
a question. I'm Babar Ali from Ikra University Gulshan campus.
Okay, we can't hear you, sorry. And if you could keep your question really, really brief because we're short of time.
All right, miss. I'm Babar Ali from Ikra University Gulshan campus. I just wanted to ask that as we know that human behavior is the learner behavior. We learn from the society as compared to books. So what we are learning. I've been growing up in an environment where I saw child abuse, child labor. There is no education. So how we can overcome on these issues? What we are doing? These are the necessary. Education is basic need. We are facing lack of education inflation, and all these things. How can we overcome, through business?
Great. So Christina, you can respond to that as well.
So
Thank
I
you.
think the first thing I want to say is that human development is much broader than education. Although the conversation has been very much geared towards education, it's essential to think about health, nutrition, to think about sanitation, water, because it's a conjunction of factors. Education itself is one part of the puzzle. So the other aspect I linked to this one that I wanted to say is that while education is a necessary condition for for contributing to the economy and for individual development and having a better life, it is not in itself a sufficient condition. And so if jobs are not there, and if there is not a sufficient alignment between what the economy needs and requires and what the education systems are producing, you might find yourself also unemployed. The question then becomes, what do you do with your education, right? And then, following up on your point, I was trained as a physicist. Should I wait for a job as a physicist? There's so very few, right? Or I was trained as a lawyer. There's so many lawyers. Should I just be sitting down and wait to be a lawyer? Or should I adjust and adapt? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is the basic foundational skills that everybody should and is entitled to, and education should provide, every education system should provide. When it comes to skills development at a technical level and at a broader level, we are in a much more complex territory, which involves how the economy is progressing, involves which agencies are providing the training, because many times the most appropriate training might not even be provided by the formal education system, might be provided on the job, might be provided through apprenticeships. So what I would say is that this linkage between the supply and demand in terms of what is required in a skilled population needs to be very thought through and needs to be very well and consolidatedly developed. Otherwise, and I go back to my own country, I think at some point higher education was, mushrooming in such a way that there were far too many psychologists for all the big psychological problems that the Portuguese may have.
Right.
Okay, so, and we do like to feel depressed and sad at points, so we do have that part. So there has to be a good balance, which is difficult, it's not difficult to do. I also want to say that I think that there's one part, and I've tried to say this already, one part is what is the core function of the state in providing education, health, social protection. And then there's also what everybody else can do and what other agencies can do. And when it comes to youth, when it comes to out-of-school population, adult literacy, I think we need to think collectively on what second chance education programs look like, what literacy skills we want to deliver to people, and what, like we've been talking here, different platforms can do. On the specific issue of getting trained and making products, micro-enterprises are very complicated, and small enterprises are also quite complicated. So I think here we probably, even us, as people working in the education sector, we need to work more with our private sector colleagues to understand, and our social protection colleagues in terms of looking at economic inclusion, to understand how we can better give suggestions to ensure that policies and interventions can be developed to improve these linkages I've spoken of.
Okay, so Junaid, your turn.
Very, very brief addition to Christina's point. Let it be no surprise that the state of education and health is poor in Pakistan. Congratulations to all of us. Less than 900,000 people in a country of 200 million people filed their income tax last year. This year, the deadline was 30th of September, then it was moved to 30th of October, now it's been moved to 31st of November. Let me ask the question to everyone in this audience, how many of you have filed your tax? It's like a restaurant with 200 people, with one person having paid the bill, and 199 saying the sushi isn't fresh. So please, my fellow countrymen, let us also look inwards. Let us also look inwards. That is, if you were to ask me where does the change process in Pakistan starts, it starts with taxation. Your relationship with your state develops the day you start paying taxes. Even if you want to take an Islamic example, as soon as the conquest of Makkah was complete, the Holy Prophet, the first thing he said, accept the faith, be a part of Islam, you pay 2.5% zakat. If you are not, if you don't want to be in the fold of Islam, no problem. Your faith will be protected. You will be protected. You will pay jizya 4.5%. Establish day one what your relationship with the state is. So just to lay it out there, we talk about education and healthcare, and we talk about the government taking all the responsibilities. How many people have filed their taxes? I think people who don't file their taxes, if you're a non-filer, you should not even be allowed to buy a car or buy a house. Should be a filer card. If you're a non-filer, you should be like an alien, almost like a criminal. Coming to your point on payments, think about it this way. You said, how do you secure the money? So first is the technical safety. Credit cards used to be very unsafe. Today, they're a lot safer. So fintechs will also become safer. When you look at the RAS, for example, right now, they're 98% of their business is cash on delivery. So you bring the product. Right now, the RAS is at risk. 98% pay cash, so the mobile phone gets delivered and the person says, I don't like it, or I changed my mind, and then they send it back. The company incurs a risk. When the payment will become e-payment, now of course the customer will be at risk that now I've already paid. Is the RAS going to deliver me the right phone, the right color, and at the right time or not? And the beauty of e-commerce is ratings, the customer rating and the provider rating. Over a period of time, like you rate each other. Even in ride-hailing, the captain rates the customer rates the captain. So you'll have a rating for TCS Yevo, you'll have a rating for Daraz, a rating for Kareem. So you'll be able to see who can I trust my money with more. So these are teething pains, and quality of service is also a standard that improves over a period of time in a country overall. I spend half my time in Saudi Arabia. I'm there 3 days a week, I'm here 3 days a week. The general quality of service in Saudi Arabia is extremely low. Doesn't matter whether you're at a bank or at an airport. And in Pakistan, it's somewhere in the middle. You go to Far East, you go to Thailand, and you go to Singapore, the quality of service in every aspect, from being at the airport, from at a bank teller to being at a restaurant, is higher. So these are standards that will develop over a period of time. And it's a society of mutual, and it has to do with trust. As trust keeps improving, quality will keep improving. So it's half full.
Yes, a really, really important message from Junaid here. It's about relationships. Your relationship to the state's relationship towards you, your relationship to the service provider, and vice versa. So a big round of applause for our esteemed panelists. Thank you. Okay, I would like to now invite Manuela Francisca. She's the practice manager for macroeconomic and fiscal management at the World Bank, and she's going to give a closing remarks.
Hey, has the press been okay? Or has it? Okay. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank the team for the hard work in preparing the Pakistan Development Update. And I would like to thank Sadia, that play a very important role in the preparation of this report and cannot be here with us today. I would also like to thank SDPI, who has helped prepare and organize this event today. This has been a great opportunity to bring together different stakeholders to discuss important issues related to Pakistan's economic growth. Several key themes have been discussed here today,
by the talks and by the panel's discussions that followed. Firstly, Pakistan's economic growth outlook remains positive, but this is contingent on managing the macroeconomic imbalance that have emerged in the last year. Managing this imbalance will require policy actions that Enrique discussed here early this morning. Secondly, sustaining the growth trajectory requires focus on various aspects of the economy. Today, we discussed a key aspect, the importance of human capital. Investing in human capital is important not only for improving productivity, but also for achieving inclusive growth. We must ensure that these developments and these investments in human capital are inclusive of marginalized groups, such as the poor, the unskilled, and the women, as Christina spoke here. Thirdly, catalyzing entrepreneurship can be an important driver for growth and job creation. There is a huge opportunity in Pakistan in terms of spurring entrepreneurship amongst the youth and the women. However, harnessing this opportunity requires improvement in the entrepreneurship ecosystem, as well as the overall doing business environment. Finally, growth in the medium term also requires a focus on improving competitiveness. Nadia raised important questions here today on how to improve Pakistan's export competitiveness. This, I believe, will provide a good starting point for a discussion in the second half of the day with the private sector. Let me conclude by thanking the speakers and panelists, and I would like to thank in particular the outside speakers. Junaid Iqbal, Kulsum Lakani, Vakar Ahmed, Fasi Zaka. Forgive me my poor pronunciation. And of course, I would like to thank the audience for the enthusiasm and the very interesting questions. And then on that note, I would like to invite you all for lunch. Please join us.
For long-term sustainable growth than investing in people. And this means nurturing children, improving nutrition, improving health conditions, improving and providing access to education for everybody, and very importantly, making sure that both men and women contribute to the economy. In Portugal now, the percentage of women and men in the labor market is the same. So the question then is, Pakistan. Where are we in Pakistan and what can we do? We tend to always look at the negative sides of the story because that sort of sparkles us. But I actually want to challenge you to think also on the positive sides, because there has been progress. True, I'm not going to argue with you that the progress is not what we wanted, but since 2010, we've definitely seen more children participating in school. And this is going from pre-primary all the way to secondary. We've also seen, right now, 9 in 10 persons having access to improved quality water. True, again, we're not yet there, but it's improving. And very importantly, and this is, as you can imagine, as a woman, very dear to my heart, we have more and more women delivering children under assisted deliveries and improved health conditions. The improvement here has been of 15 percentage points, which has resulted in a decrease in the number of women and children that die along with childbirth. Now, the question, and you're all saying, but you know, everybody says this is not rosy. Yes, there are big issues. And I could say that the big issue is that progress is uneven and it's slow. And the question I think for Pakistan to ask is, can the country afford this? Can the country afford not investing in its people for sustainable growth? Can actually the country afford to have almost half of its children under at the age of 5 either severely stunted or moderately stunted. These are generations that are lost. Can the country actually afford to have only 9% of its youth engaged in some form of training, higher education, or post-basic education? And let me tell you that if people are from the poorest quintiles, this percentage goes down from 9 to 1%. And finally, can we have only one woman in 4